Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating and honestly pretty provocative analysis of Atlanta. The source material asks a really simple question. How does a city's public transit system, something literally designed to connect people, actually end up engineering extreme economic division? It's a really compelling look at how urban infrastructure can silently shape a city's economic reality right under our noses. So let's just get right into it.
Before we even think about transit maps or budgets, we have to start with this one absolutely staggering number from the sources, 46 to 1. Just let that sink in for a second. That ratio right there, that's the baseline for everything we're looking at today.
So what does that 46 to 1 actually mean on the ground? Well, the data shows that while the median white household in the city holds about $238,000 in wealth, the average black household holds just $5,100. Think about the real-world fragility behind that lower number. I mean, $5,100 means a single medical emergency, an unexpected layoff, or even just a major car repair can literally lead to absolute financial ruin. It's exactly this fragility that gives Atlanta the highest urban inequality in the entire country. Which brings us to the big question. What role does the public transit system, MARTA, play in maintaining this huge divide?
The analysis breaks this down into four critical structural realities. We're going to look at the geography of fragmentation, the hidden time tax, funding and transit gentrification, and finally, a really striking contrast with the upcoming FIFA World Cup.
Let's dive right into point number one, the geography of fragmentation.
To understand how we got to that 46 to 1 divide, the texts argue we have to look at how the map was historically drawn. Back in the 1960s and 70s, outer suburban counties actually voted against joining the transit system. And the sources note this wasn't just some logistical disagreement, it was heavily driven by racialized rhetoric aimed at keeping specific populations out of certain neighborhoods. So what did that do? It established a literal containment boundary. Then, as massive job centers absolutely boomed in those northern suburbs in the 2000s, working-class city residents in the South were physically severed from those opportunities. Fast forward to today, and this geographic divide contributes to an extreme Gini coefficient of 0.5786 in the city core. If you're not familiar, a Gini coefficient is basically just a mathematical way of showing that the wealth in a specific area is being hoarded by a tiny fraction of people at the absolute top, leaving everybody else behind.
As you might guess, this history has sparked some really intense local frustration. For a lot of folks living this reality, the city feels like an economic trap. We see in the source commentary that critics argue the transit system acts way more like a logistical extraction hub than a genuine public utility meant to lift people up. It's a super powerful perspective on how infrastructure is actually experienced by the people who rely on it every single day.
And that brings us to point two, the hidden time tax. Because when you're trapped in that fragmented map, you aren't just losing money.
You're losing your day. In a closed economic system, your time is your ultimate asset, right? Imagine you're working a low-wage job, just trying to make ends meet, and you have to spend 2, 3, or even 4 hours every single day just navigating complex transfers and waiting for late buses. According to the text, that is a massive structural tax on your life. Think about what anyone could do with an extra, say, 20 hours a week. You could take classes, you could start a side hustle, or, just get some extra rest. Trapping low-wage workers in this exhausting daily cycle burns the exact currency they need to get ahead. The commute itself literally drains the energy required for wealth-building activities.
And the sources emphasize that this tax is incredibly asymmetric. There's a massive divide between what urban planners call the choice rider and the dependent rider. On one hand, you have heavily funded fixed rail networks that cater directly to affluent choice riders commuting into the central business district. On the other hand, you have a sprawling, under-resourced bus network. For working-class neighborhoods, these buses are an absolute lifeline. But using them often means standing on the shoulder of a hot highway, no shelter anywhere, waiting for a delayed bus just to make 2 more complicated transfers. They carry the heaviest burden of that time tax, for sure.
Now for our third structural reality, funding and transit gentrification. Because riders aren't just paying with their time.
They are paying with their wallets, often twice over, creating this brutal extraction loop. First off, working-class residents fund the system through regressive local sales taxes. That means the tax takes a bigger bite out of a low-income earner's paycheck than a high-income earner's. On top of that, they're paying $2.50 out-of-pocket fares just to use the system they already subsidized. But here's the real kicker the analysis points out. When premium transit expansions, like, say, a shiny new rail station, finally do happen, it spurs what planners call transit-oriented development. Developers swoop in, they build luxury apartments, and suddenly local property values absolutely skyrocket. So, the long-term working-class residents who funded that station, They can't afford to live there anymore. They get displaced even further away from the urban core, usually out to areas where the transit network doesn't even reach. Taking a look at the budget projections for fiscal year 2026 makes the priorities crystal clear. Out of $732 million in gross operating expenses, a staggering $489.4 million is earmarked for labor, administration, and expanded policing. So rather than using those local tax dollars to aggressively expand service and close that geographic wealth divide, the material argues the money cycles primarily into maintaining this self-preserving bureaucratic apparatus. Which perfectly sets up our final point. Section 4. The FIFA World Cup contrast.
Because the critique in the material sharpens dramatically when you compare these everyday realities to a massive global spectacle like the upcoming 2026 World Cup. The contrast here is jaw-dropping. Everyday riders, they deal with frequent delays and shifting service tiers, but the FIFA Surge Plan, 5-minute train headways. Everyday riders stand under underfunded bus shelters. FIFA gets a $104 million modernized fare system. Everyday service sees routine bus shortages, while FIFA gets a rapid response backup fleet of 30 vehicles. The sources point out that this proves unequivocally that the system absolutely can run highly frequent, hyper-efficient transit. The capability is there, it just chooses to deploy that capability for a fleeting event for global tourists rather than for its everyday tax-paying residents.
And this frustration is so palpable on the ground. The source materials capture this raw reality from local street vendors. These folks are just trying to make a living during big games, but they frequently find foot traffic heavily restricted or totally bypassed by new transit corridors. As one local vendor perfectly put it, that money wasn't never for us. The city markets at Black Atlantans' expense. It's a stark reflection of the feeling that massive civic investments consistently bypass the actual communities that fund the infrastructure in the very first place.
Ultimately, the commentary leads us to a really uncomfortable realization. The text actually rejects the typical bureaucratic language of transit optimization entirely. The argument here is that the system isn't broken at all. It's functioning exactly as it was designed to. It acts as an economic conveyor belt. It efficiently imports low-wage labor from the margins to maintain the affluent core's lifestyle, and then exports that labor back out at the end of the day. It essentially maintains a labor pool that is liquid, meaning people can physically move to get to their jobs, but economically stagnant. It subsidizes the core at the total expense of the margins.
Which leaves us with this final, deeply provocative challenge raised by the source texts. When public infrastructure preserves or even facilitates a 46-to-1 wealth gap over decades of operation, who is the public it actually serves? It completely reframes how we look at civic planning, infrastructure, and economic sovereignty. Definitely something to think about the next time you're looking at a transit map. Thanks so much for joining me for